Hello everybody. Just to edify on the last video I was talking about with the prophecy of the twins and whatnot. So if you look at even a prophecy of Judah and Tamar and the prophecy of the twins in that situation too, um, outside of talking about Jacob and Esau, if you look at it, remember Moses came down first with the Ten Commandments because he spoke with the hand of fire or the burning bush, right? And the original law was my law is light, my burden is light. The Ten Commandments, a universal law to keep people civilized. But then, right, we'll call that Zerah. But then Zerah stuck his hand out. But then when Zerah went to go pull his hand back, the scarlet ribbon was placed on it. So then Perez came out. Remember what happened to the law and the holiness once the anger and wrath of Moses came down in that book. Then eventually what happened was, we'll say Perez came out. But then if you look what happened later down the line, when John the Baptist came and he baptized the word, what then happened to the writing? It became like a scarlet ribbon, the red writing. And there's a lot of different actual prophecies foretelling different things in that book. And I don't want to just say when I treat this book solely like book report logic and stay when I stay inside the book, I gain more actual wisdom. Because what happened to me at first was, in my timeline, I had got to the point where I was so terrified to look at that Bible or read it that I'd be like shaking when I read it. Because this is when I was totally still in spiritual deadlock and like the magic of it all and the stories and all that. But over time, once I was able to identify and pinpoint where's different. So I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. Throughout my life living in America, there's a lot of propaganda and movies and documentaries talking about who built the pyramids, what happened in ancient Egypt. They don't respect the accomplishments of people, the Africans, and things that happen in Africa in that geographical location. So they create documentaries talking about aliens came in and time warps and all this other stuff. And so another aspect they do that with is they do that a lot with Muslim culture also, and that came with the caliphate, but that came a lot earlier than the caliphate. You see, when I talk about Arabs and when I talk about Moses, there's a situation where if you listen to historians and people that do documentaries and stuff, they'll say the reason that these current archaeologists and Jewish people know about Israel is because they were reading a stele in Africa and Kemet, or what they call Egyptian now, Egypt. What happened with this stele was it read, a people without a king was defeated by the Africans. The reason why that's important is because that is literally talking about Moses' tale. They say all the time in documentaries, who is Moses? Was it Akhenaten? Was it Ramses? Was it this pharaoh? Was it this person? Not one time in my life have I ever heard somebody bring up the name Moses. Upon doing research and reading a pharaoh list of my own, I found the literal man Moses. I will make you like a god to them, right? Who was raised as a stranger in his own homeland because the Hyksos invaded 300 or 400 years before that. Moses created the third kingdom and was one of the first pharaohs. He brought the gods from the ancient Africans and instituted new laws and brought the kingdoms together. The reason why that changed my life is because I was so caught in these fairy tales and the ideas. I began to read Noah and noticed how the suffix of Noah is the same as Pharaoh. Means Narmer, who was one of the first African kings, was the one who went out and built cities to the east and stuff like that. They called him Shua in Canaanite texts, like a great father. That's why they say Ham and Canaan, because those are African and Middle Eastern stories, or Asia. So Middle Eastern. Why is it the middle? What is it the middle of? Africa and Asia. When people branched out a long time ago, I told y'all, look up who the Sam Bushmen are. When people went out a long time ago, they came back, the Hyksos, out of Canaan, thousands of years later, 1,000 years later. When they did this, they invaded Africa and tried to create a new kingdom. When those Asiatic and African people mixed back, they became Arabs. I have no reason to lie to y'all. When I found out a lot of this stuff in actual history, I then began doing more research and found out about a man named Akhenaten. Where does Netanyahu get that name? They have likened Joshua to Akhenaten. He went out and actually invaded Canaan and these other lands and was a warrior. He was bringing old African gods, but he was renaming them instead of Amun, it was the Aten. It was basically the same thing. But then his son betrayed his own father and people, and then uh, Harem Hub and Ahab and different people are. You have to look these pharaohs up. They're on the list of line of pharaohs who are a totally different faction of people. That Akhenaten's son, when he died, the whole bloodline was cut off because his kids died too, and then different generals and different people and kings became new pharaohs, leading back to oppression again. So when I found all this out, I found out the only man, and he was found in Jerusalem, surrounded by people in his burial, and he was buried with an ossuary, with a tomb that read, Yehohanan ben Hagios. Then I found out they follow after and worship after rabbis named Yehoshua from Joshua and Yehohanan ben Zakkai, who is John. This man, because of his sacrifice, and he appealed to Vespasian, in real history, saved a lot of Jewish people and sages. He got a whole bunch of sages that were able to be relocated to another temple, and they were able to write about all this. And a bunch of Jewish people were allowed to go up and move into Africa, Rome, and many different places in Europe and Africa. They didn't go up into Europe like that because those were Vikings and barbarians. And they weren't introduced, they were slaves at first and weren't introduced into civilized history until like 800 AD. Then because of the mass migration and because of the Byzantine and the English church, many people with fair skin, because why are Romans and Italians, and then why do they have darker skin and they're yellow and wasn't considered Americans back in the day? They mixed with Europeans over time and got lighter skin. Another testimony against these races is the DNA they found in those volcanoes when dealing with the Gladiator 2 when they tried to attack Denzel for being one of the actors. It was African DNA in those volcanoes and the surrounding areas. Before the Caliphate happened, those people were, or around the Caliphate, they were pushing into Morocco and those different places and civilizing Rome and the European areas. Why do Russian buildings look like buildings in the Middle East and India? I have no reason to lie to y'all. And so when I learned about a lot of this history, I learned that people fighting for no reason. Like if you take Yehohanan's name, they put Yeshua for a cutoff of Hohanan, and they just put the beginning J-E or Y-E. Then eventually when the French and the Romans and all them got involved, it became Yesuit or Yesuas, which is still I am, the same message and name. But then further down the line, in mockery, when they were fighting, because the Byzantine and the English church, they were fighting and doing all kind of crazy stuff, it became Jesus. They buried people with pigs' heads and horse heads back in ancient Rome. They tortured their enemies, and when they conquered other kings, they believed in killing kings and leaders, which led to a mass revolt, which got Nero in trouble. It wasn't just one person crucified either. They crucified like thousands of people, which led to a revolt, which got Nero overthrown, and then Vespasian came into power, and he appealed to Yehohanan apparently, because one of the things he said was after Nero's destroyed, because of Vespasian's power, Vespasian is going to come to power. When you guys think of like sages and stuff, a holy man, you guys have to understand, especially in the Arabic community in the old Middle East, them people were learned men and geniuses, and in Africa and stuff. You guys are being fed like voodoo and witchcraft and pagan. No. The numbering system you guys use, a lot of this agriculture, everything people use, from mixing and melting stones to create greater stones, came from Africa and the Middle East and Asiatic peoples. And so after I was able to understand that these stories were taken from other cultures and civilizations to take away a lot of the buffoonery, the actual buffoonery actually began to help me, because I could learn from these stories, these murderous, enslaving stories, and learn how change is good over time and create my own logic and wisdom within and learn how these subtle changes are what create beautiful things in humanity. Because look at another interesting prophecy many people don't think about. If the Holy Spirit was baptized and created greater and more beautiful, to where men, instead of wanting to kill each other and be racist and factionist, but taught of love and holiness versus like repentance and forgiveness versus stone you for die for what you did or kill your enemy and hate your neighbor. Y'all should read the 613 mitzvahs sometime and the law of and the law of Noah. Ridiculous. When you take it into totality and take away from your fear of the cosplay and fake gods that were created and Satan that's masquerading as God and punishment, and understand what's truly happening to the mind and psychology. And so, and why would Noah sacrifice 7 clean animal spirits? Think deeply about what I'm telling y'all. And so then, what I'm essentially saying is, I can use those stories and metaphors of examples of why I shouldn't do things. I'm going to give y'all a crazy example. Sometimes in my mind, when my mind tries to wander off sexually, it'll bring the story of David to my mind, of how David went and sacrificed that man in war and took that woman and they bore a child and it was then destruction and what happened. Or how Solomon went too wise in wisdom and out here in mystic and magical stuff, and then look at how many teachings and how much witchcraft he created. I look at every story and example how Samson's pure rage led him to destruction, how Elijah's infamy led to fire and destruction, but even how even how John the Baptist, as soft as a lamb, who testified against the law of Moses, and even Yehoshua, I call it because I don't like saying Jesus, how they constantly were saying the law of Moses this, the law that, I am against the law, I testify against the law, the blah, 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 I am simple and light, I am, right? That testifies back when the word first travailed. And so these things come together, and I can clearly think with my own thought and create new ideas and a new heavenly places. I can clean out the old heavenly places and create new, righteously, to the best of my ability, because I can't physically bind or control any man. I try not to, but simply try to teach a new way and baptize with new words, not magic holy water.